Gordon, and I'm here today with Ellen Birkett Morris, and we are talking about her story, Inheritance, from her short story collection, Lost Girls. Hi, Ellen.
Hey, Kelly. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you here. I can't wait to talk about the story. First of all, I just want to remind everyone that they will have read the story, so we're going to go through the whole thing, and we'll be talking about the ending as well, so spoiler alert. I love this story, and I would love to hear about how the story first came to you, or the idea of this story.
Oh, absolutely. I'll be glad to talk about that. This is a story idea that I had for years and years. So about 10 years before I wrote the story, I was sitting at the dinner table with my sister-in-law, Jonna, who is from Western Virginia. And she started to talk about really strange folk ways that they had in Virginia. The fact that they would save dead people's hair and teeth. And when somebody had surgery, they would bring the organs home and keep them in a jar. And then she started to talk about sin eating. And sin eating was this folkways tradition where when somebody would die in a community, particularly somebody who was very wealthy, they would pay a poorer person to come in and symbolically eat the sins of the person who died. And they would pull this off. They would have the person, fully dressed, the deceased person, but they would place a cake on their body. And then the sin eater would pick up the cake and eat it and say a pledge, and they would have symbolically absorbed for money the sins of this wealthy person. And I wanted to do something with the story for years, and I kept trying to find a way in. And I'll be completely honest about it. It was only during the Trump era that I could figure out that, how long have poor people been eating the sins symbolically, of wealthier people? How long have people put up with just being taken advantage of and being used in different ways? And I saw that he had this large base of voters that really were acting against their own interest in a way. And I saw that they were it reminded me of that idea of the sin eater and the unfairness of it all. And so I was able to sit down and write the story. And because the stories are set in Kentucky, in rural Kentucky, I decided to go back in history a little bit and set it in a coal mining town and have there be this huge power imbalance. And so that's how this inheritance story is. That's how it was finally born. So,
and the cake that they set on the dead person really sounded like a horrible cake. What are they made of? Are they always made of the same thing?
They can be made of different stuff. There's a contrast in the story. Her first sin-eating job is for a couple who has come in, moved into the community. Their child dies, and they make this gorgeous cake that has raisins and currants. And the sin eating that she does in the course of the story happens for the family of the owners of the coal mine and the two brothers who have survived their mother, and they make this horrible burnt little plain piece of cake to give her, which is sort of stands in for their personality, how little they have to give, how very withholding and small they are as people.
Yeah, and they don't care that it scrapes on the way down her throat, and she practically is ready to throw up while she's eating it. And okay, the narrator, we never get her name. I read the story twice, after I read it, to ask you all these questions, and I scoured it again. We don't get her name, do we?
No, I don't guess we do. I guess that was an oversight on my part.
No.
So,
I think I actually thought that was a great thing, because she sort of stands in for, this could happen to many people.
Yeah. Well, and despite not having named her, I felt like I knew her so much. And in fact, the knowledge I began to gain about who she was really drove the decisions that I made in the story. And I ended up making decisions that I'd never imagined I would make, that were really hard for me to make. I really wanted to find ways to ease her way out of this. And yet there was nothing about the time or her circumstances that would allow me to do that. So
So what time period are you envisioning this taking place?
So this is sort of, and I'm I'm notoriously bad in terms of historical periods, but this is sort of, the railroads are in, coal mining is a major, part of the work that's being done. So it's kind of back in those times. It's back a ways, and at a time when I guess some forms of sort of ignorance could be excused because it was the way things were done. It was simply the structure, it was the social structure, and it was the way things were done, and appearances mattered, and there was a great hierarchy, in terms of wealth and social structure.
Yeah, I was noticing so Mrs. Cabot is, she's wearing her purple brocade with pearl buttons and her matching earrings. And it's funny, like, it's a strange outfit. And I was trying to picture like what that meant, that outfit.
Yeah, I think part of it is that she would dress, they're in a coal mining town. So nobody else in town is wearing anything that looks like that, and yet she's got her finest clothes on. This is probably what she would wear to church just to remind people of who she was and what her social status was. The brocade dress, clothing that she wore would be finer than anything they'd seen or worn or anything that would adorn their homes. And then, the decision to include the pearl in there, as I note a little bit later, the pearl is something that supposedly is the product of irritating an oyster. And so she could see perfectly why this woman would pick pearls as the things she would want to wear.
Yeah, I love that. And what about the Duncan Fife table? Because I used a Duncan Fife table in a story. And then when I read it in your story, I was like, I can't remember why I used that.
Yeah. I think I was inspired to use it because my mother-in-law was an antique dealer. And so, and I loved her a lot, but she was really funny about the antiques. She would really, she'd say, "Oh, this is a fine piece," and she'd run her hands across this furniture. And it was really, I could tell that it held a lot of meaning for her, and I think that's what I thought about that. I thought about the sort of glorying in possessions and particular kinds of possessions that denoted higher status. And so that was what drove me to make that choice. I wanted it to be a very fancy table, in a place where, they'd be the only family dining that sort of way. Yeah.
Yeah, it was perfect. So the narrator's, her mama, as she calls her, has spent years mopping Mrs. Cabot's floor, and her mama believes in God's final judgment, but not the narrator. And I just wanted to, and that drives her mother's decisions, to tell Daniel when she leaves on the train, and she sees the Cabots as benefactors. So I would love to talk a little bit about the formation of Mama, or the parents, and all they allowed.
Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, this again, these were hard choices to make, but I gave her these really hardworking, sort of God-fearing parents who really didn't understand the damage that they were doing. On the one hand, the family, I make it really clear that the family is starving. When the parents allow the coal mine owner's son to come in and rape their daughter, basically for money. And so I set up a scenario where I kind of give a hint that they're not too bright because they built their house in an area that flooded, and it took them a certain number of years to figure out to put the house up on stilts, but also that they were really desperate, that they were really starving. And, it never occurs to the girl in the story that this would be something that they would subject her to. But again, this is the social order they live in. These are the people who have the money and the resources. And I guess this is sort of their bottom line as far as, they're going to starve. And so they set up this scenario where she gets repeatedly raped by this guy. Yeah. And again, the mother sees the coal mine owners as benefactors, as people who, I mean, she's so dependent on them that she's lost sight of her own interest entirely, or her own sense of agency entirely. And I think that this can happen to people, whether it's financial dependence, whether there's a physical sort of a dependence, these sorts of really unhealthy relationships can be set up. And I think that's part of what allows oppressors to oppress people, is that they've got them in a situation where they feel there are no other options. So that was what I was getting at with that.
Yeah, it's a slippery slope, She probably doesn't, she might even think, I was thinking, well, she might even think he'll take a shine to the girl and marry her and get them out of there, which is ridiculous because he treats her terribly. But I could see, she probably had a fantasy in her mind of how this would benefit them later. I don't know. So, okay, let's see. So there are the two brothers. There's Daniel and there's Abraham. And you did allow Abraham to be a little nicer than Daniel. But tell me about how you came up with those two characters.
Yeah, I really, Daniel is just the classic bully. He's just sort of offensive in every way possible and presumptuous and has zero respect for her and takes what he wants and is horrible. And then, I make Abraham slightly more educated. He goes away to school and becomes a lawyer. And so, that for me, this idea that the more educated of the brothers would also possibly be the more kind of the two, and then one less likely to, do the sort of oppressing that Daniel does. And so I thought it'd be a nice contrast. I needed to give her a way to get a hold of enough resources to try to get out of there. And Abraham does that. He leaves her, he hands her extra money after she does the sin eating. So yeah, that's how I set that up. Sort of a contrast and also an avenue into another part of the story.
I love the fact that she stays in the room with Mrs. Abbott and watches as Mrs. Abbott's face slowly turns to stone. And of course, you envision them all as stone the entire time because they're so unfeeling. At one point, she gets pregnant and she's nauseous and she realizes she's pregnant. And then she says that one day soon her state would reveal itself and then there would be hell to pay. And I thought, and that made me wonder, well, isn't everybody expecting this? Because this guy has been repeatedly raping her. So what did they think would happen? And why would there be, and what kind of hell did you envision?
Right. Well, I mean, what I figured would happen at that point would be that she would, two things would happen to her and both would be horrible. One would be that her income would be, their family's income would be cut off because, he would be done with that. And she would be universally shunned and seen as this horrific sinner when in fact she had been sinned upon, if we were getting down to brass tacks there. So that's it. I imagine that she would sort of become a non-entity in that community based on what had been done to her. And the unfairness of that, I thought, was really strong. And again, it's another force of pressure on the narrative. It's another way that her options get narrowed and her circumstances get more intense and more dangerous. And so that, I was really, really pleased. And, I work fairly intuitively, but I was really pleased. Like I had her in the room and then I decided she was pregnant. And I was like, yes, there we go. What they say about getting your characters in trouble and then getting them in worse trouble, so.
I love that. And when she leans down and says to Mrs. Cabot, I'm carrying your grandchild to the corpse.
Yeah.
So you get her on the train and she has this cup of tea with cream and sugar. And I was thinking, when I first read it, oh my gosh, she's going to get out. And then she said, and she has this idea that this will become her new ritual, that she'll have a cup of tea in the afternoon while the baby sleeps. Prince, West Virginia, its hunger and fear would be far behind her. And at that point, I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe she's going to make it. But of course, it is totally unrealistic. And when he stops her in Charleston, you think, okay, of course she's not going to get away. And how would she have managed being from that small town, never being off that little elbow of land where she lived. So I'm just curious. So we're talking about deconstructing the story. As you're writing the story, say your first couple of drafts, does she start to make it? And then when does it occur to you she's not going to make it?
Oh gosh, yeah. I wanted her to make it so badly. I wanted her to make it so badly. And I was trying to work out how she would do it. Well, she would take in sewing. And so she'd be working in her house and people wouldn't be that aware of her circumstances, or she could say her husband died, all these things she could do to be functional in that environment. But then I thought, really, that there was no way that he was going to let her go. There was no way that he was going to let her go. He didn't know yet about the child, and he had used her, and this is who he was, and he was powerful, and he would have taken it as an affront. So I knew that he had to go after her, and then I spent a long time thinking about, well, what could happen in the train station? Like, could she set up some kind of an alarm or somebody come to her assistance? And then I thought, that's not what happens in these stories about women. That's not what happens in reality often with women's stories. Nobody's waiting to save us. Nobody is waiting to save us. So it was clear to me that she was going to be brought back, and I'd have to figure out what she did then. And because she's so strong and because she's defiant at this point and just tired of it, I had a real feeling that, that drove me towards the end of the story. And I really didn't want to write it. I mean, as I was sitting there imagining her going to this barn and taking this rope off the wall, the whole time I was thinking to myself, oh, I don't want to go here. I don't want to go here, and yet, my thought was, what she's going to do is an act of complete defiance right in front of his house. She is going to hang herself from the tree in front of his house with a pregnancy that's starting to show, and people are going to know, exactly what he did and the degree to which just exactly what his sins were, the degree to which he had sinned against her. And it would be this big act of defiance. At the same time, the last lines there, aren't incredibly hopeful lines, because what they say is that, this kind of stuff happens and this will happen again. So even as she did it, knowing that she would shame him in front of the neighbors, knowing that she would take away the thing that would have been most precious to him, another member of that horrible family, even as she was, but there was a boldness and a defiance to it. And so, but again, the last lines of the story really show that she knows this isn't going to be the end of it, but this is her final statement to him.
Yeah, I love that last paragraph. I don't know if you have it there, but I did type it out here. If you want to read the last paragraph, I'd love to hear it in your voice.
Oh, sure. I'd be glad to do that. And this, again, is one of those things that when it came to me, it was like one of those writing moments where you're like, oh, this is magic. Here we go. Mm-hmm. I imagined my body swaying in the wind, a spectral figure in my dark cloak. The bees would still buzz, the river would flood, girls would get visited in the night, and the Cabots would sit counting their money, polishing their silver, with no idea of what had been taken from them. I let myself fall.
I just love that. Oh my gosh. I mean, it's horrible, but it felt like, as in the best stories, it was horrible, but it felt so real. It felt like it was the inevitable ending. And of course, we ended up here. There was no way out for her. And I love the fact of the dark cloak, because it sort of contrasted with me. I was thinking, oh, well, what other cloaks do I think of? I think of, Red Riding Hood's cloak is red and she survives, right? Like, but, or maybe not in I don't know if she survives in the original. I don't know. But the one with the watered down version, she survives. And this is a dark cloak, a black cloak. And, it just fit really well, but very, very sad too. And of course, this is ongoing. It's so metaphorical about what happens to women even today.
Yeah, I mean that's this whole book was really. I'll tell you honestly, this collection of stories when I first envisioned them were stories from the perspective of a male photographer who was going through a small town, and then Me Too happened, and it occurred to me that the best parts of those stories were the women in the stories, and that I had fallen into that trap, that male gaze, as a way of telling a story that has been perpetuated for years. And I just, first off, I just wanted to slap myself. But then I was like, no, I'm just got to get to work. So I got to work and I've got those stories together. And I pulled that photographer out of most of the stories. He makes a cameo in one of the stories. And I pulled together all the women-centric, girl-centric stories that I had. And that's how the collection was born. And it took a huge cultural event for me to realize that my focus had been off. Mm-hmm. That the stories that I had to tell were really about these women and not about how this male photographer sees these people or what his life was like, but what their life is like.
Well, since you brought up the whole collection, tell us a little bit about how this story figures into the collection, and maybe just, a little bit about some of the other stories. And
yeah. What I've got is a range of stories about girls and women, and really that center on issues of seeing and being seen, that talk about the things that happen to women. The first story, Lost Girls, a young girl disappears. Again, that happens still today all the time. And it's about how another woman seeks to commemorate her life by leaving things for her. There are stories about young women. There are stories about two young girls who are best friends, and one of the girls' mother faces a cancer diagnosis and how they lean on each other. There's a story about an older woman who sees her face in the mirror, doesn't like what she sees, and covers all the mirrors in her house. And yet she's able to help an older male friend of hers deal with his own struggles with aging and with memory loss. And finally, she comes to reconcile the idea that, she may be older, but she still feels 16, that person is still inside her, that beauty is still inside her. And so, the stories run the gamut of women and girls' experiences, and really wanting to come at it from different angles and wanting to depict it from I've got one set in modern times about a young couple, and the guy can't get off his phone. and so she's just like, finally, she's like, all right, they're abroad and he's on his phone. They're in Italy and he's on his phone. And so finally she leaves with this waiter and just takes off, and that's it. Yeah. So from that standpoint, I mean, it was really fun to try to, see if I could cover the gamut of different kinds of experiences. And, I've got a grieving mother in there. I've got a woman who meets up with a neighbor, somebody who'd been a childhood friend, a neighbor who had been abused, and she feels the weight of her complicity for not speaking up because she had noticed the bruises when they were children. Right. A lot of tough topics, but ultimately, I think uplifting, on the whole.
Yeah, and a lot of humor and a lot of, texture to all the stories. In fact, so one, just the small things that I noticed was your use of a lot of smell, like citrus scent of his cologne and the lemon and vinegar in the house, and then the lavender sachet. There's a, what do you call that? A leather?
Oh, yeah, sachet or something.
Satchel, lavender sachet. So how do those, because just in terms of crafting, a lot of times that would be the scent that I might ignore. I don't often think about adding any scent to my stories. So how does that come to you? The different.
I think I had a sort of a revolutionary experience in terms of my development as a writer when I took a workshop at the Kenyon Writers Workshop with Ron Carlson. And Ron Carlson is he's a great advocate for the use of detail or what he might call inventory in your stories, that by using a lot of very specific detail, not only do you reveal character, but you sort of do things that will give you a sense of where you're supposed to go with your plot. You can sort of propel yourself forward plot-wise as well with some of this detail. And he's a great believer in that. And so, I was so taken with the idea. And when I started to use it in my stories, and then there are people who just will tell you over and over again, employ all the senses. So, I think I just had that in my mind when I was sitting down to do that. And so I start now with all that detail, and it can be, really quirky stuff. It can be very sort of universal stuff. But even if I really don't know the character, so in a story I'm writing right now, I've got a character who's leaving Montana. She's fleeing her husband because of a tragedy that's happened. And, she's got an open bag of M&Ms in the car, which she eats in the way that she was taught in her mindfulness class, which also leads her to think about the fact that green M&Ms in high school, boys used to say that green M&Ms would make girls horny. And so she said that was a precursor to the roofies. They would slip in people's drugs when they were in college. So M&Ms can become this whole thing. M&Ms is her mindfulness and the boys that she knew in high school and, all of that. And so I try to take a detail and just follow it in that way. And really, it's a great place to play. It's a great way to explore. And it helps me, make these characters more real. And it's just without a doubt, it's sort of been a non-fail way to do it because you can always take details out,
Yeah, but you have that great detail about Yeller, the spot on the wall. And I thought that was perfect. It comes back in 3 times, I think.
Yeah.
At least 3 times. And the last time it's during the daylight and it just looks like a dark stain. It doesn't, but that's a focal point for her. And then, it is true that when it's happening, it becomes much more real when you visualize her staring at this stain on the wall and you think, okay, well, she's leaving her body now. She's being, she's having a disassociative moment and she's trying to escape this scenario that she can't get out of. So it really worked really well, that detail.
Yeah. Well, and that's it. She tries a lot of things. She dissociates, she does a lot of things, but ultimately she couldn't escape what was happening. And that's what leads her to her end. But detail has been fantastic. And Ron Carlson has a book that I think is called Ron Carlson Writes a Book, which takes you with him on his process. So if you're looking to sort of explore that for yourself, that might be a good place to start.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. That is a wonderful tip. And I appreciate it. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I appreciate it so much, Ellen. I love the story. I love the book. And it was great talking with you.
Great talking with you. Thanks so much.
I'm Kelly Forden, and I'm thrilled to be here for the 3rd season of Let's Deconstruct a Story. I'm also a bit giddy because the podcast is now being produced in collaboration with the Grosse Pointe Public Library in Michigan. The GPPL has committed to purchasing 10 books by each of these authors to give to their patrons. If you are a short story writer who has tried to make money in this game, then you know what a big deal that is. My hope is that other libraries will follow the GPPL's lead and be inspired to buy books by these talented short story writers. I'll be contacting many libraries this year to suggest it. Please feel free to do the same if you feel so inclined. Libraries need good books, and good books are written by writers who devote themselves to craft. A win-win in my estimation.